we have Andy Yule, who's going to be talking about the governance of the HE data landscape. So, Andy, thank you.
So I'm not sure who's more relieved about this session being before the conference dinner, whether it's me or whether it's you. But I'm going to sort of update you a little bit on some of the work we've been doing around data governance, really building on the work that we've been pursuing over the last few years around the HE data landscape. And by way of an introduction and a little bit of background to what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, the journey started in 2011, around the time of the white paper Students at the Heart of the System, 2011, which was the government before the previous government and their attempt to get some HE legislation through. So this goes back an awful long way. The issues around the data landscape that we have been trying to address: massive duplication in data collections, this 525 data collections that your institutions have to deal with every year. A lack of standardization. If you've heard me speak before, you know I'm obsessed by the definition of the word course and the number of different definitions of the word course that we all have to try and get our heads around. The lack of oversight and leadership of the data landscape, the reason we are in this mess, and a whole load of issues around skills and capabilities. So the HEDIT programme ran for 3 years. It came to an end last summer, and the HEDIT programme created this architecture for the data landscape going forward. This architecture we are now carrying forward, being led by HESA, which is where I'm now spending most of my time when I'm not on the road. The architecture, I'm just going to say a few words about the boxes at the bottom, and then most of what I want to talk today about is this governance issue. So the standardization and rationalization. The standardization piece first, okay, we've done a whole load of work around creating a logical data model that will underpin data collections across the piece for student and curriculum data. That's where the majority of data collections currently sit. And in putting that big logical model together, we have looked at all of the data collections that we can find that go on, whether they be funding, regulatory, professional bodies and so on. So we've got that whole standardization piece. One part of that is HECOS, the subject coding system, which you might have heard of. Hopefully you've heard of it, and hopefully colleagues back in your institutions are now busily recoding all of your courses and modules with the new HECOS codes, because JAX is dying. HECOS is going live from 2019, and that date 2019 means that to get your UCAS data updated in the first half of next year, your colleagues need to be recoding all of the courses now against the HECOS subject coding system. I'm quite excited about HECOS. Earlier this week I spoke at the Wonkfest in London, which was awesome. They had an awards ceremony, and we won an award for HECOS. I've been in this business 30 years, and I've won an award for a subject coding system. Achievement unlocked. Rationalization. So rationalization is all about, most of the action here at the moment is around data futures. Data futures, again, I hope you've heard of it, I hope you're aware of it. This is the big piece of work that my colleagues at HESA are doing to re-engineer the entire HESA data collection process to make it more frequent, to make it more timely, and create a data platform that can be used by a whole load of other organisations who currently run their own data collection. When we ran HEDIP, we identified about 90 organisations who come to you every year for student data. And it's bonkers. There has to be a better way of doing it. We interviewed a third of them. We interviewed about 30 of these organisations, and we concluded that actually everybody wants basically the same stuff. Yeah, they want stuff about students, what the students like, the courses they're on, the qualifications they come in with, the qualifications they leave with. Basically, that's kind of what everybody's interested in. But the biggest factor why everyone else is running their own data collection is that the HESA data currently is so slow. And you know, anyone here who's involved with the HESA return or has been involved with the HESA return, you know, we have just closed the HESA return for the year 16-17. Data will be released in January 2018 for students who registered in September 2016 all right? And this is the 21st century. It takes us 15 months to get some data out about student registrations, which is ridiculous. We kind of got away with that in 1994 when we started all this. But it just doesn't stack up now. So Data Futures is where it's happening. We have published the data specification, we have published the collection process, we have published the timescale of information. We are working with the software houses. In fact, today in Cheltenham, we have an event. My colleagues are speaking with the software houses because that's the question I get asked more than any. We are also working with the institutions who run in-house systems as well, but we absolutely recognise that software houses are in the critical path in terms of the delivery of Data Futures. Finally, improved capabilities. We've done a whole load of work around data management and data governance capabilities within institutions. We have taken over 100 institutions now through the CMM self-assessment for data capability, data management and governance capability. If you're familiar with the 5 levels of CMM, the lowest one is chaos. The sector is not in chaos. It might feel like it sometimes, but the sector is not in chaos when it comes to data management and governance, but we're kind of the next stage up. We're in reactive. We're fairly deep in reactive, which essentially means when it comes to data management and governance, we are broadly firefighting all the time. We aspire to the middle level, which is called stable. Stable, think of stable as if you're walking into a hospital and say, how's the patient? Well, he's in intensive care, but he's stable. Okay, that's kind of where the middle line is, and that's what we aspire to in that space. So that's kind of all the stuff around that. Obviously, huge amount of information about that on the website. I want to talk about collective governance, because this idea of collective governance, so there are hundreds of organisations out there collecting data from you every year, and they are all independent, autonomous organisations. Many of them are government organisations, and of course in higher education, the government goes 4 ways across the UK, and so there is no body or authority, maybe short of God, who can tell all of these organisations that they must change behaviours and they must change how they work. So we have created the Data Landscape Steering Group, which is not the catchiest title, but it is important, and I think over the next couple of years, if this all works as we hope and anticipate it will work, this group will become actually the locus of a whole load of leadership and oversight activity across the landscape. We talk about demand and supply, so the group is balanced between leading figures from the demand side, the data collectors, and leading figures from the supply side, HE providers. On the supply side, we have got a range of leading individuals. We've got a CIO, we've got Nick Leake, the CIO from King's. We've got some people from the planning community. We've got a couple of COOs, registrars. We've got people from alternative providers. They are all there in a kind of personal capacity. They are not there to represent an institution or an organisation or a community. They are there because of their own brilliance. On the demand side, similarly, we have got people from different perspectives. So we've got the chief executive of HESA. We've got a senior person from the NHS on that group. We've got one person from the funders. We've got someone from PSRB and so on. So the group is balanced in terms of its membership between demand and supply. We have an independent chair. The chair now is Professor Simon Gaskell, who until this summer was Vice-Chancellor and Principal at Queen Mary University of London. He was also, as it happens, the chair of the HESA board. He has now retired in the way that HE people do, and he is now chairing the Data Landscape Steering Group, and I'm delighted that we have got him on board. It is supported by a broad advisory panel, and if you have heard me speaking previously about the HEDIT programme, you remember we were at a big advisory panel, and we have always had, I will say, we have always had excellent support and engagement from this community on the advisory panel. Peter Tinson sits on the advisory panel. Gareth from Ulster sits on the advisory panel. And you are always there at the very heart of the conversation. This group is all about the standardisation and rationalisation of data flows. So it's that, those elements of that model. And it's about changes of behaviours and improved capabilities. And it's really about changes of behaviours I want to talk about today. How does one go about governing the data landscape? Now, if you're an organisation, we kind of understand what governance means. So your organisations will have a governing, broadly, yeah? So, your organisations will have a governing body. It might be called a council, it might be called a board, but, there is the idea that within your organisational structure, there is a body that the executive reports to and is held accountable to, and it makes senior strategic fabulous decisions about the way forward and has some kind of authority, some kind of hard mandate over the organisation. We do not have that in the information landscape because, you know, we have got the funding councils, we've got the NHS, we've got the Royal Society of Basket Weavers, we've got the Home Office, we have got the Student Loans Company, you know, we've got all of these different organisations out there collecting data. They're all independent, they're all autonomous, some are charities, some exist by virtue of a royal charter. And so this is a very different approach to governance that we are trying to take here. So in terms of changing behaviours amongst this group, what we have done is we have developed 2 codes of practice. And they are models of good behaviours. And there was a code of practice for the demand side, and there was a code of practice for the supply side. And through the publication and promotion of these codes of practice, we hope to change behaviours in terms of the way that data collection operates to achieve the broader goals that we are looking to achieve. So I'm going to say a few words about the 2 codes of practice. The supply side code of practice, well, we didn't write it. It kind of already existed. A couple of years ago, the Higher Education Funding Councils got together and said all of those data returns that you make to us funding councils, or that you make to HESA on our behalf, we want you to adhere to a code of practice. And the funding councils created a code of practice drawing heavily on the ONS code of practice, all right, so this isn't just made up out of nowhere, based on the 3 ideas of honesty, impartiality and rigour. So when they talk about honesty, they say don't lie. Yeah, they say do not withhold information. If you find problems, if you find errors, inform folks promptly. When they talk about impartiality, they say, you know, you have to be objective. You mustn't skew the data one way or another to get a particular result. And when they talk about rigour, they say when you make your HESA returns, you should do repeatable documented processes, because I think now, you know, broadly you all have repeatable documented processes for your HESA returns. 10 years ago, I would not have stood on a stage and said that. And things like estimations and assumptions should be defensible and tested. All right? In this code of practice, the funding councils put this code of practice out in 2015 and said, you have to adhere to this. You didn't get a choice. You were not consulted. It is a condition of funding. It is a condition of regulation. That is the way the world works. And this was launched to apply to those returns that go to the funding councils and to HESA. Okay? Now, there's nothing here really that you can argue against, is there? Yeah, it's a little bit motherhood and apple pie, but there's a sense in which that's where its strength comes from. It says be honest, be impartial, and operate with rigour. It's about doing the right thing, okay? So what we have done over the last 6 months is we have taken those 3 principles of honesty, impartiality, and rigour, and we have reflected them back to the data collectors. And we are now saying that the data collectors should behave with honesty, impartiality and rigour. And we have created something where there is some symmetry here. So for honesty, for the data collectors, we are saying if you are going to run a data collection, you have to be transparent and open about the uses that you are going to put the data to, as much as you know them at the time. Yeah? You have to be just transparent and open in that. And you must respond to scrutiny of requests. You must be prepared to justify why you are asking for this data. All right? I mean, you're not going to argue with that. Impartiality, you must be objective, you must act in the greater public interest, you must not define your data request in a way that tries to steer you towards a particular result. Yeah? So you must be impartial about this. And you must be rigorous, and I think this is perhaps, for me, the strongest area of this. It talks about repeatable and documented processes. It talks about burden assessment. You must be cognizant of the burden that you are imposing on institutions when you run a data collection. And you must use standard definitions. We know what a course is now. We have a definition for it. We've got a whole data dictionary of definitions in this space. So you must use standard definitions, and you must not duplicate existing requests. Yeah? Or at least if you do, you must have a very strong defensible rationale for doing it. So this is saying to the data collectors, justify what you're doing. All right? There's nothing here that they should argue against. And just as the code of practice that applies to you, there is nothing there that really people can argue against. There is nothing here that we should argue against. And so, within the next week or 10 days, I'm trying to get a space on the grid. It's amazing. Within the next week or 10 days, we are going to be launching the Code of Practice for Data Collectors. And this is going to be going out there and saying, this is how data collectors should behave. This is coming from the Data Landscape Steering Group. This is collective governance of the landscape in action. And these are the sort of behaviours that we think data collectors should be adhering to. And this is kind of only going to work if the sector gets behind it, if the sector supports it and says, yes, actually we demand that you just follow some basic common sense motherhood and apple pie stuff, because you expect that from us, and therefore we have a right to expect that from you as well, okay? So the rigor one talks about burden assessment. Burden is a very interesting issue. I've been in this game for many years now, and throughout my time in HE Data, vice-chancellors and registrars of the sector have been banging the table about the burden of data collection. And they've been saying there is too much burden of data collection, and we want to lower the burden of data collection. And that has become the accepted wisdom, even to the point that in the HE and Research Act that went through Parliament earlier this year, there was explicit mention of the designated data body, HESA, working with other data collectors to reduce burden. It has become part of the political dialogue around higher education. We must reduce the burden of data collection, right? It's become accepted wisdom. Yeah. What does burden mean? How do we define burden? How do we measure burden? We have found ourselves in a place where we have a statutory mandate to work to reduce burden, and we have no idea what it means. We have no idea how to measure it. So we need to put that right. So we have done a whole load of work over the summer and over the autumn to understand the burden of data collection. There is a model of burden assessment which operates in the NHS in England. And all of their data collections have to go through this. So we spent a bit of time in Leeds at the NHS offices, and we have stolen some elements of the burden assessment model that the NHS use, because it's brilliant. We've learned quite a lot from how they've done this. So the burden of data, we have to move on from just this table banging about the burden of data collections. We need to understand what drives it. And in broad terms, I think there are two things. If you think of the burden of data collection as being the pain or the cost that you go through to satisfy a data request, I think there are two broad drivers. One, it's something about what is being asked for, and the other is something about the efficiency or not of your data management and governance. And this kind of goes back to the earlier thing I was saying about the state of the nation in terms of data capabilities, and the fact that actually we're not that good at the moment. We're still quite reactive. We're not chaotic, but we're still quite reactive in terms of data issues. And so when we think about the amount of pain, the amount of cost that we go through to satisfy a data request, there is part of it that I, as a data collector, am imposing on you, but there is then an element of gearing or shooting yourselves in the foot, however you want to describe it. There is an element to which your internal issues around data management, data governance are gearing that burden, and in some cases will be making it more painful than is associated with the data request. And so we kind of need to unpick some of that. And we have created a standard approach to the assessment of burden. It's based on 6 lenses. We've stolen these from the NHS. We've tweaked some of the definitions a little bit. But these, we think, and we've been out and done a whole lot of consultation and workshopping around this with all sorts of different colleagues around the sector. But we think these are the 6 lenses through which we can assess burden. Something around gathering data. So the idea, is it a bit of data that you already hold for your own internal business processes, or is it something that you would never ask for, but HESA's asking for it, and therefore you have to gather the data? So if I go out and ask for inside leg measurement, you probably aren't collecting that from your students. That would score very highly there. There's something about assuring the quality, the extent to which the quality that is demanded by the data collector goes above and beyond the quality that you have, or that at least you should have, maybe, for your internal operations. There's something around extraction and transformation. To what extent does the definition of the data that I'm asking for match or not the definition of the data that you hold? There's something about the process of transmission. I mean, how much of a grind is it to actually get the data from you to the data collector? There's issues around system change and development, and within that there's something about lead times. And there's also, we think, something around training and guidance. You know, do we write a data definition that is clear and understandable by human beings? Do we provide support? Do we provide training and so on? So we think these are the 6 lenses through which burden is assessed. There are then a number of ways in which we assess them. We think there are separate assessments for setup and for run. So if you think about a change to the HESA student record, for example, you know, we might do that thing, say, give us inside leg measurement. So the first year, there's a whole implementation thing. Yeah, you have to make system changes, you have to make process changes, you have to do all that stuff. So there's a whole pile of stuff around setup. And then in subsequent years, there's something about run. And we think potentially those things are quite different shapes. So there's something around understanding the burden of setup and understanding the burden of run. They're scored simply between 0 and 10, and there's a whole load of information about how you scored them. And then there's a sense in which they are assessed for the demand view, and they are assessed for the supply view. And so the demand view is the assessment that says, you know, if we had a perfect university, this is how much, you know, we think, how much burden we think is associated with this request. And the supply side there says, but in the reality, we are not perfect, we're a different shape, it doesn't work for us, and therefore this is what we think the burden is to us. And what we can then do is analyse that, we can plot that, we can have hopefully a more mature conversation with the sector about burden by looking at the difference between the demand view for burden and the supply view for burden, and try to understand what we as data collectors can do to minimise the burden and help you as providers understand where, in terms of data management and governance, you are, you know, gearing pain in or shooting yourselves in the foot, or however you want to land that language. Okay, so there's a whole process there. And there's a sense in which what we're trying to achieve here is a more mature conversation about burden. All right, because we need to move on from this thing of just banging the table and saying the burden's too much, all right, because that's not getting us very far. All right, we have to have a more meaningful conversation. And yes, there is a sense in which kind of, you know, the scoring is a bit arbitrary. It's between 0 and 10, you know, whatever that means. But there's just a sense of, you know, is this a really painful thing? Is it not a painful thing? It gives us a framework within which to have that debate and actually make some more informed decisions. And so as a part of the operation of data collections, we are saying that any data collector should now be going through a process that looks like this. We're putting out a model which is how HESA are going to implement this, and as a part of the launch of this, I'm going to be going off and talking to all sorts of data collectors, starting with the big players, obviously, and saying, look, you know, this is a way of behaviour that the sector wants. This is a way of behaviour that we should all be aspiring to, and then hopefully we can have a more mature conversation, a better understanding around the burden of data collection. So the next steps in this process, as I said, we're going to be launching this stuff within the next week or 2 weeks, once I've got a slot on the grid, and there will be hopefully a load of comms going out through all sorts of different channels and blogs and news articles, and everyone's going to go, yeah, it's a big step forward in terms of actually changing behaviours across the data landscape. We then go into a kind of, you know, a monitoring of take-up and implementation, and over the years, over the longer term, you know, we will want to review and improve this model. I'm sure it's not perfect. I'm sure we haven't got it right first time. So the Data Landscape Steering Group are going to want to keep a very close eye in terms of how this moves forward and this is carried forward, okay? So there's a sense in which kind of, you know, when we started this data landscape journey, I thought it was about data. Yeah, I thought it was about definitions. I thought it was about technical stuff. It isn't. It's about people. It's about changes of behaviours. And that's kind of very much where the focus is now. And it's been a real interesting journey, a real challenge to try and take this conversation out to the sector. And I kind of want to leave you with one thought, and I've discussed this final thought with Peter previously. I spend a lot of my time stood on stages like this talking with the different communities across the sector. And you know, the kind of different communities across the sector I talk with UCISA, I talk with the heads of university administration, the Student Records Officers Conference, the Council for Higher Education Internal Auditors, AMOSHI, whatever that stands for, the Academic Registrars Council, the planners, and so on, and so on, and so on. Okay, we have been talking about the issues around data capability, data landscape, the data burden, all right, across all of these different groups, all these different professional communities for the last 5 or 6 years, all right? When we did the whole data capability stuff within institutions, one of the big issues we found was that data is often very siloed within institutions. Trying to carry this conversation forward at a sector level, I have run into, a greater or lesser extent, I have run into a similar kind of siloed mentality amongst some of these groups. All right, some are worse than others. Peter, I think, is brilliant in terms of engaging with the other professional groups out there. Some of them are less good. Some of them are very insular, very inward-looking. All right? If we are going to move the data agenda forward, we kind of have to be more joined up amongst these professional groups, amongst these professional communities, because data is everybody's issue. And sure, everyone has a different perspective on it. Everyone has a different take on it. So your perspective on data issues will be quite different to the planners, or the auditors, or the academic registrars. But you all have a perspective on fundamentally the same issue. And if we are going to get to a point where the sector is actually making real progress in terms of the management of its data and driving real value out of data, as well as complying with GDPR, obviously, you know, we have to take, as a sector, a far more holistic approach than we currently do. And one of the things that I think is blocking that, and I am saying this to every audience I speak to at the moment, one of the things that is blocking that at the moment, I think, is the extent to which data is not dealt with more coherently across the professional groups and the professional bodies. And so I am putting that call out to all of the professional communities across the sector at the moment, because I think we have an opportunity with the changes in the landscape, with data futures, business intelligence, HIDE, learner analytics. Everybody wants data. Data's where it's at. You know, Paul Clark, the chief executive of HESA, was in the Wonky Power list this year. Yeah, for the first time, data's where it's at. And if you've read the OFS consultation, the new regulatory framework in England, you know, data is absolutely at the heart of that. And Sir Michael Barber is saying, and OFS are saying some very, very robust things about their demands and their expectations around data moving forward. So there is a sense in which data really has come up the policy and the political agenda. I'm just going to stop there now, I think. I don't know how I'm doing for time. But thank you very much for listening. Have we got time for a question or two?
We do, yes.
Does anyone have a...
Oh, Andy, thanks for the update and thanks for the credit. I'll buy you a pint later. Just one quick thing. You talked about using the burden assessment with data collectors. There are probably two words that Joe Johnson utters that strike fear into every university sort of leader, and that's light touch. Whenever he says that, you think it probably isn't going to be.
Yeah.
Is this, are you going to be asking the government to justify some of the data that they're asking for?
Yes.
Stop there.
Well, no, but we are. So, you know, those bright ideas that ministers have end up becoming policies, which are then enacted by funders and regulators, which are then often surfaced as fields in the HESA student record. Now, up until now, we have not had a language by which to describe the burden associated with a field in the HESA student record. Yeah, we've never been able to have that. We haven't had that framework to have that conversation. There's a lot of soft information that comes back, a lot of, you know, anecdote, a lot of responses to consultations, but we haven't really had the ability to say that, you know, inside leg measurement field, that's a 9. Justify why that's a 9. Yeah, and so this is an opportunity for us to do that. And the code of practice is very clear that data collectors, you know, have to be prepared to stand up and justify their demands for data. And having an accepted way of talking about the burden, I think, will be a very, very big lever in that justification. So with the caveat that there is actually quite a long food chain between the government minister and the people running the HESA data collection, yes, no, absolutely the aim of this is to weave that into this conversation about the burden of data collections. The burden assessment process is not itself without burden, which is a bit meta. But we have to engage with the burden assessment process if we're going to have a more mature conversation about burden. All right. So a part of the burden assessment model is that when there was a change request going out for a new field in the HESA student record, for example, we are going to ask you and your colleagues to tell us and score this about how much the burden is through those 6 lenses. So it is not a burden-free process, but there's a sense in which we kind of have to all buy into it to have that more mature conversation and to be in a position where we can challenge the data collectors to justify why the hell they need inside leg measurement. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay, in that case, thank you, Andy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.